Okay, I hope I'm ready this time, folks, because this is a big one here. And I tend to get animated when I start talking about people I love. And although I never met this guy, I love him just researching him, you know? There's some people whose life stories just motivate and empower you. And Tony Bennett is one of those people. His journey began in Astoria, Queens, New York in 1926. And he was named Antonio Dominic Benedetto. Yeah, he came up in a completely Italian family. Both parents had immigrated here from southern Italy. And it was pretty much a working class, lower middle class family. So he worked from the time he was a little kid through his entire life, right to this very moment. We'll deal with that in another part of this treatment. I'm going to try to do this coverage of Mr. Bennett in two segments. The first segment dealing with his birth to the 60s, when his career kind of subsided due to the invasion of Britain the second time. This time they actually won the war. That's the Beatles and Dave Clark 5 and all that. Rolling Stones. Yeah, that kind of hurt his career quite a bit. So we're going to take this first segment up to that point in his career, and then we will do the aftermath, okay? So now, early on, as I said, he was struggling with two loves, as many musicians do. He loved visual art, and he loved music. And there are a lot of people who say, well, yeah, that's strange. Well, no, it's not strange. Miles Davis did the same thing. All of his ties were creations that he actually first painted. A lot of his later album covers were covers that Miles Davis himself created. So this business of being visual artists as well as musicians is quite common, as is the three-prong attack that some artists have, where they are visual artists, they are musicians, and they're also actors. So artistic is artistic, and Tony Bennett is very, very artistic. He liked to draw caricatures as a kid, and he was known for that. And not always, how shall I say this, positive caricatures of people. He liked to have a little fun too, and he probably got in trouble for that just a little bit. But he always had this voice. And there is this anecdote from his early life. When he was about 10 years old, he was picked to sing for the opening of the Triborough Bridge. Yes, he was picked to sing for the opening of the Triborough Bridge. And the mayor at that time, LaGuardia, another Italian, of course, actually put his hand on his head after he sang and kind of anointed him as a really good Italian singer. So he started getting accolades as a young boy at 10 years of age. That didn't help him financially too much because his young days were spent working in restaurants as a waiter, a singing waiter, of course, and that voice he had helped to increase his tips. So for a long time, as a young man, Tony was singing in restaurants as a waiter. And that's what he did, and he got little gigs here and there, but nothing really big. He was just doing what he had to do to make a living, and hoping that he would get lucky somewhere along the line. He loved singing. He ended up going to school for commercial art because he thought that that would be a more stable income for him. Somewhere in the late 40s, he would have been somewhere around 22 years old, 21, 22. He was drafted into the service and ran afoul of a Southern sergeant who did not like, number one, Italians, and did not like his New York accent. So he put him on the fast track to the front lines of the war. He went into the infantry, which means he carried a rifle. And before he knew it, he was in the middle of the Battle of the Bulge. That's right. German weapons firing big bullets everywhere, jumping in the foxholes, people dying all around him. He even got to liberate a concentration camp, which housed mostly captive Americans who, let's just say, were ill-treated. This experience led him to make a statement that war is a nightmare that never ends. And anyone who supports war only does so because they've never been in one. So he became an anti-war protester, activist, and a pacifist to this very day. After the war ended, he remained in Germany for a while and was reassigned to a kind of a service band, where he got to sing for the military officers and some enlisted men. And it was during this time that he met an old friend from high school he decided to actually have a meal with. The problem was, this old friend was black. The military was not integrated at that time, so this was looked on with great disfavor by his superior officer. And as punishment for crossing some imaginary racial line, guess it wasn't so imaginary, he was assigned to a grave duty. And what that was is collecting the remains of those who are dearly departed, and then trying to identify who they are from what remains of their bodies, and then packaging those remains for shipments back home. This is another horrific episode in his life. And it simply hardened his hatred for war, all because he decided to have a meal with a friend who happened to have a little bit too much melanin in his skin. At any rate, the war did end. And Tony did come back home, and based on the experience he had with the Army Band, he continued to sing little gigs here and there. And he decided early in the career that he could not be Frank Sinatra. He was given that advice. Don't try to do what Frank does. Do something different. He admired Frank Sinatra. But in order to have a career distinctive from him, he decided, you know what? I'll do pop tunes. I'll do the great American songbook. Although in his heart, he really wanted to do jazz. But there are already a lot of jazz singers out there. So he started his career doing pop songs and the great American songbook, which he loved because he thought the songs from that era, the 30s, the 20s, are perhaps some of the greatest songs ever written, both in terms of the lyric and in terms of the music. And that suited him just fine because he did have a refined taste for music and composition, etc. And that is how his career started. And soon the hits started. things like Because of You, Blue Velvet. Next thing you know, he's becoming a national name. And his star is rising. And the bigger he gets, and the more honors he gets, the more traveling he does, and the more money he makes, and the more comfort he derives from all of this, the more he wants to do what he wants to do, which is a little jazz. So the first move was to hire a jazz guitarist to lead his band, add little jazz flavors to it. That lasted 2 or 3 years. And then finally he started just hiring other jazz musicians like Joe Jones and people like that to come in and do it the right way. He actually did a recording with the Count Basie band. Basie swings, Bennett sings. Groundbreaking album. And perhaps the very first time that a male vocalist had recorded with Count Basie's band. Yeah, that was Tony Bennett. He continued to take this double forked road in his career. Pop songs, the American Songbook, the Great American Songbook, and jazz. It is amazing that he remembers that when he came back from the war, one of the biggest promoters he had in order to get him regional and national attention was the great Pearl Bailey. She was the one that said, you know, you got a voice. I think I want to have you open up a couple of shows for me. Pearl was big. So to have this Italian guy opening up for Pearl Bailey is opening him up to a wide audience. He never forgot that. And there must have been something very special about him because Pearl Bailey saw his humanity and his talent, not his skin. Because obviously, Tony Bennett looked at her and everybody else the very same way. Oh yes, he did. So, not only was he an anti-war activist, he was raised through the Depression. And politically, he had a very harsh commentary about President Hoover. And as a result, he became a lifelong Democrat. And so when we started moving toward racial integration, racial justice in the 60s, during the protests, Tony Bennett supported that cause. As a matter of fact, something a lot of people don't know is, on the March to Selma, Tony Bennett marched right beside Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Yes, he did. So he supported the cause of a unified America. So much so that he is called a national treasure by most people. And the UN has designated him a citizen of the world and one of their top ambassadors. Because he did what Martin said we should all do. Look not at the skin, but the content of the character. And Tony was doing that long before Martin ever said it. As he thrilled audiences all over the world with his music and his art. Oh, he continued to paint. He continued to paint. Matter of fact, if you go to the Smithsonian Art Museum, you will find some of Tony Bennett's works hang in there, as well as you will find them in some other very fine and unexpected art galleries around the world. So he has continued his visual artwork, his music, his philanthropy, his pacifism, and his staunch anti-war philosophy. And he continues to work for a United States of America and racial justice for all. We'll talk about the 50 million records that he sold in the next segment. But in this first segment, I want to give you a sense of the man and his journey against all odds, and how he is the American dream in the flesh. And 94 years and still going. Anthony Dominic Benedetto, thank you very much for your service to us all.